Okay, guys, we are reading from the Forgotten Books of Eden. We are going to be doing the letter of Aristeas. We ended on chapter 5 last time, so we're going to start with chapter 6 and try to go to chapter 8 since they're kind of long. Okay, so chapter 6. Explanations of the customs of the people showing what is meant by the word unclean, the essence and origin of the God belief, verses 48 to 44, give a picturesque description of the divinity of physiology. It is worthwhile to mention briefly the information which he gave in reply to our questions, for I suppose most people feel a curiosity with regard to some of the enactments in the law, especially those about meats and drinks and animals recognized as unclean. When we ask why, since there is but one form of creation, some animals are regarded as unclean for eating and others unclean even to the touch. For though the law is scrupulous on most points, it is specially scrupulous on such matters as these. He began his reply as follows: "You observe," he said, "what an effect our modes of life and our associations produce upon us. By associating with the bad, men catch their depravities and become miserable throughout their life. But if they live with the wise and prudent, they find the means of escaping from ignorance and amending their lives. Our lawgiver, first of all, laid down the principles of piety and righteousness and inculcated them point by point, not merely by prohibitions, but by the use of examples as well, demonstrating the injurious effects of sin and the punishments inflicted by God upon the guilty. For he proved first of all that there is only one God, and that his power is manifested throughout the universe, since every place is filled with his sovereignty, and none of the things which are wrought in secret by men upon the earth escapes his knowledge. For all that a man does and all that is to come to pass in the future are manifest to him. Working out these truths carefully and having made them plain, he showed that even if a man should think of doing evil, to say nothing of actually effecting it, he would not escape de- detection, for he made it clear that the power of God pervaded the whole of the law. Beginning from his starting point, he went on to show that all mankind except ourselves believe in the existence of many gods, though they themselves are much more powerful than the beings whom they vainly worship. For when they have made statues of stone and wood, they say that they are the images of those who have invented something useful for life, and they worshipped them, though they have clear proof that they possess no feeling. For it would be utterly foolish to suppose that any one became a god in virtue of his inventions. For the inventors simply took certain objects already created and by combining them together showed that they possessed a fresh utility. They did not themselves create the substance of the thing, and so it is a vain and foolish thing for people to make gods of men like themselves. For in our times there are many who are much more inventive and much more learned than the men of former days who have been deified, and yet they would never come to worship them. The makers and authors of these myths, think that they are the wisest of the Greeks. Why need we speak of other infatuated people, Egyptians and the like, who place their reliance upon wild beasts and most kinds of creepy things and cattle and worship them and offer sacrifices to them both while living and when dead? Now, our lawgiver, being a wise man and specially endowed by God to understand all things, took a comprehensive view of each particular detail and fenced us around with impregnable ramparts and walls of iron, that we might not mingle at all with any of the other nations, but remain pure in body and soul, free from all vain imaginations, worshiping the one Almighty God above the whole creation. Hence, the leading Egyptian priests, having looked carefully into many matters and being cognizant with our affairs, call us men of God. This is a title which does not belong to the rest of the mankind, but only to those who worship the true God. The rest are men not of God, but of meats and drinks and clothing. For their whole disposition leads them to find solace in these things are reckoned of no account, but throughout their things. Among other people, such whole life, their main consideration is the sovereignty of God. Therefore, lest we should be corrupted by any abomination of or our lives be perverted by evil communications, he hedged us round on all sides by rules of purity, affecting alike that we eat or drink or touch or hear or see. For though speaking generally, all things are alike in their natural constitution, since they are all governed by one and the same power. Yet there is a deep reason in each individual case why we abstain from the use of certain things and enjoy the common use of others. For the sake of illustration, I will run over one or two points and explain them to you. For you must not fall into the degrading idea that it was out of regard to mice and weasels and other such things that Moses drew up his laws with such exceeding care. All these ordinances were made for the sake of righteousness to aid the quest of for virtue and the perfecting of character. For all the birds that we use are tame and distinguished by their cleanliness, feeding on various kinds of grain and pulse, such as, for instance, pigeons, turtle doves, locusts, partridges, geese, also, and all other birds of this class. But the birds which are forbidden you will find to be wild and carnivorous, tyrannizing over the others by the strength which they possess, and cruelly obtaining food by preying of the tame birds enumerated above. And not only so, but they seize lambs and kids and injure human beings too, whether dead or alive. And so, by naming them unclean, he gave a sign by means of them that those for whom the legislation was ordained must practice righteousness in their hearts and not tyrannize over anyone in reliance upon their own strength, nor rob them of anything, but steer their course of life in accordance with justice, just as the tame birds already mentioned consume the different kinds of pulse that grow upon the earth and do not tyrannize to the destruction of their own kindred. Our legislator taught us, therefore, that it is by such methods as these that indications are given to the wise that they must be just and affect nothing by violence and refrain from tyrannizing over others in reliance upon their own strength. For since it is considered unseemly even to touch such unclean animals as have been mentioned on account of their particular habits, ought we not to take every precaution lest our own characters should be destroyed to the same extent? Wherefore, all the rules which he has laid down with regard to what is permitted in the case of these birds and other animals, he has enacted with the object of teaching us a moral lesson. For the division of the hoof and the separation of the claws are intended to teach us that we must discriminate between our individual actions with a view to the practice of virtue. For the strength of our whole body and its activity depend upon our shoulders and limbs. Therefore, he compels us to recognize that we must perform all our actions with discrimination according to the standard of righteousness. More especially because we have been distinctly separated from the rest of mankind. For most other men defile themselves by promiscuous intercourse, thereby working greatly in great iniquity, and whole countries and cities pride themselves upon such vices. For they not only have intercourse with men, but they defile their own mothers and even their daughters. But we have been kept separate from such sins, and the people who have been separated in the aforementioned way are also characterized by the lawgiver as possessing the gift of memory. For all animals which are cloven footed and chew the cud the symbol of memory. Represent to the initiated the symbol of memory. For the act of chewing the cud is nothing else than the reminiscence of life and existence. For life is wont to be sustained by means of food, wherefore he exhorts us in the scripture, also in these words, Thou shalt surely remember the Lord that wrought in those great and wonderful things. For when they are properly conceived, they are manifestly great and glorious. First, the construction of the body and the disposition of the food and the separation of each individual limb, and for more, the organization of the senses, the operation and invisible movement of the mind, the rapidity of its particular actions, and its discovery of the arts display an infinite resourcefulness. Wherefore, he exhorts us to remember that the aforesaid parts are kept together by the divine power with consummate skill. For he has marked out every time and place that we may continually remember the God who rules and preserves us. For the matter of meats and drinks, he bids us first of all offer part as a sacrifice, and then forthwith enjoy our meal. Moreover, upon our garments he has given us a symbol of remembrance, and in like manner he has ordered us to put the divine oracles upon our gates and doors as a remembrance of God. And upon our hands, too, he expressly orders the symbol to be fastened, clearly showing that we ought to perform every act in righteousness, remembering our own creation, and above all, the fear of God. He bids men also, when lying down to sleep and rising tip again, to meditate upon the works of God, not only in word, but by observing distinctly the change in impression produced upon them when they are going to sleep, and also their waking, how divine and incomprehensible the change from our one of these states to the other is. The excellence of the analogy in regard to discrimination and memory has now pointed out to you according to our interpretation of the cloven hoof and the chewing of the cud. For our laws have not been drawn up at random or in accordance with the first casual thought that occurred to the mind, but with a view to truth and the indication of right reason. For by means of the directions which he gives with regard to meats and drinks in particular cases of touching, he bids us neither to do nor listen to anything thoughtlessly, nor to resort to injustice by the abuse of the power of reason. In the case of the wild animals, too, the same principle may be discovered. For the character of the weasel, mice defile and damage everything, not only for their own food, but even to the extent of rendering absolutely useless to man whatever it falls in their way to damage. The weasel class, too, is peculiar, for besides what has and brings forth through the mouth. And it is for this reason that a like practice is declared unclean in men. For by embodying in speech all that they receive through the ears, they involve others in evils and work no ordinary impurity, being themselves altogether defiled by the pollution of impiety. And your king, as we are informed, does quite right in destroying such men. Then I said, I suppose you mean the informers, for he constantly exposes them to tortures and to painful forms of death. Yes, he replied, these are the men I mean, for to watch for men's destruction is an unholy thing, and for laws and our law forbids us to injure anyone either by word or deed. My brief these matters ought to have convinced you. Reference also calves and rams and goats which are offered. He said it was necessary to take them from the herds and flocks and sacrifice tame animals and offer nothing wild. The sacrifices might understand the symbolic meaning of the lawgiver and not be under the influence of an arrogant self consciousness. For he who offers the sacrifice makes an offering also of his own soul in all its moods. I think that these particulars with regard to our discussion are worth narrating, and on account of the sanctity and natural meaning of the law, I have been induced to explain them to you clearly. Philocrates, because of your own devotion to learning. Okay, chapter 7. The arrival of the envoys with the manuscript of the precious book and gifts, preparations for a royal banquet. The host immediately upon being seated at at table entertains his guests with questions and answers, some sage comments on sociology. And Eleazar, after offering the sacrifice and selecting the envoys and preparing many gifts for the king, dispatched us on our journey in great security. And when we reached Alexandria, the king was at once informed of our arrival. On our admission to the palace, Andreas and I warmly greeted the king and handed over to him the letter written by Eleazar. The king was very anxious to meet the envoys and gave orders that all the other officials should be dismissed and the envoys summoned to his presence at once. Now, this excited general surprise, for it is customary for those who come to seek an audience with the king on matters of importance to be admitted to his presence on the fifth day, while envoys from kings or very important cities with difficulty secure admission to the court in 30 days. But these men he counted worthy of great honor, since he held their master in such high esteem. And so he immediately dismissed those whose presence he regarded as superfluous and continued walking about until they came in and he was able to welcome them. On which the law was inscribed in gold in Jewish characters, for the parchment was wonderfully prepared, and the connection between the pages had been so affected as to be invisible. The king, as soon as he saw them, began to ask them about the books. And when they had taken the rolls out of their coverings and unfolded the pages, the king still stood still for a long time, and then making a obeisance about 7 times, he said, "And I thank you, my friends, and I thank him." And when all the envoys and the others who were present as well shouted out at one time and with one voice, "God save the king," he burst and told him to weep over his good fortune. God, that I should first of all pay my reverence to the books for the sake of which I summoned you here, shall be kept as a great day, and it will be celebrated annually throughout my lifetime. It happens also that it is used, he said, should express their delight. He gave orders that the best quarters near the citadel should be assigned to them, and that preparation should be made for the banquet. And Nicanor summoned the Lord High Steward, Dorothy, for as many cities have special customs in the required custom, in order that there may be no discomfort to disturb the enjoyment of their visit. This is paid point in accordance with the king's instructions, for he had ordered him to make half the men sit at his right hand and below honor. When they had taken their seats, you're not walking across here. If you want to go across here, I'll help you. When they had taken when they, in accordance with the customs, where he dispensed with the services of the sacred heralds and the sacrificing priests and the others who were accustomed to offer the prayer language, the king asked the envoy who sat in the seat of honor, or they were arranged according to security, if you were to imitate the unceasing benignity of God. For if you exhibit clemency and inflict mild punishments upon those who lead them to repentance. The king praised the answer, and then you take the fear of God as your starting point, you will never miss the goal. The king complimented this man too upon his answer and asked another how he could have friends like minded with himself. He replied, "If they see you studying the interests of the multitudes over whom you rule, you will do well to observe how God bestows his benefits on the human race, providing for them health and food and all other things in due season." You're just going back and forth this musical chair. You okay? If they see you, they are always fulfilled, while those who fail to obtain an answer to their prayers are informed by means of dreams or events of what was harmful in the request, and that God does not mean to their sins or the greatness of his strength, but acts with forbearance towards them. The king praised the man warmly for his answer and asked next in order how he could be self-discharged all his duties in the spirit of justice. Welcoming this answer, he applied if while making forces he remembered the minds of men by granting reprieves and making merely a display of the greatness of his power. The king praised and then said to the next, "What is the highest good in life?" And he answered, "To know that God is Lord of the universe, and that in our finest achievements it is not we who attain success, but God who by his power brings all things to fulfillment and leads us to the goal." The king exclaimed that the man had answered well, inspired with high motives, in all your undertakings, and by warning your descendants not to be dazzled by fame or wealth, for it is God who bestows all these gifts, and men never by themselves win the supremacy. The king expressed his agreement with the answer and inquired of the next guest how he could bear with equanimity whatever befell him. And he said, if you have a firm grasp of the thought that all men are appointed by God to share the greatest evil as well as the greatest good, since it is impossible for one who is a man to be exempt from these, but God, to whom we ought always to pray, inspires that good. I will put a question to one another, he added, and then I will stop the true aim of courage. And he answered, if a right played by the philosophers, for not a few of them were present, it is my opinion that these men excel in virtue and possess extraordinary knowledge, and have all made God the starting point of their word. True, O king, for since the universe is managed by providence, and since we rightly perceive that man is the creation of God, it follows that all power and beauty of speech proceed from God. When the king had nodded his assent to this sentiment, the speaking ceased, and they proceeded to enjoy themselves. When evening came on, the banquet ended. Okay. Chapter 8. More questions and answers. Note verse 20 with its reference to flying through the air, written in 150 BC. On the following day, that sat down to table again and continued the banquet according to the same arrangements. When the king thought that a fitting opportunity had arrived to put inquiries to his guests, he proceeded to ask further questions of the men who sat next in order to those who had given answers on the previous day. He began to open the conversation with the 11th man, for there were 10 who had been asked questions on the former occasion. When silence was established, he asked how he could continue to be rich. After a brief reflection, the man who had been asked the question replied, if he did nothing unworthy of his position, never acted licentiously, never lavished expense on empty and vain pursuits, but by acts of benevolence made all his subjects well disposed towards himself, for it is God who is the author of all good things, and him man must needs obey. King bestowed praise upon him and then asked another how he could maintain the truth. In reply to the question, he said, by recognizing that a lie brings great disgrace upon all men, and more especially upon kings. For since they have the power to do whatever they wish, why should they resort to lies? In addition to this, you must always remember, O king, that God is a lover of the truth. The king received the answer with great delight, and looking at another said, what is the teaching of wisdom? And the other replied, as you wish that no evil should befall you, but to be a partaker of all good things, so you should act on the same principle towards your subjects and offenders, and you should mildly admonish the noble and good, for God draws all men to himself by his benignity. The king praised him and asked the next in order how he could be the friend of men. And he replied, by observing that the human race increases and is born with much trouble and great suffering, wherefore you must not lightly punish or inflict torments upon them, since you know that the life of men is made up of pains and penalties. For if you understood everything, you would be filled with pity, also it pitiful. The king received the answer with approbation and inquired of the next, what is the most essential qualification for ruling? To keep oneself, he answered, free from bribery, and to practice sobriety during the greater part of one's life, to honor righteousness above all things, and to make friends of men of this type. For God too is a lover of justice. Having signified his approval, the king said to another, what is the true mark of piety? And he replied, to perceive that God constantly works in the universe and knows all things, and no man who acts unjustly and works wickedness can escape his notice. As God is the benefactor of the whole world, so you too must imitate him and be void of offense. The king signified his agreement and said to another, "What is the essence of kingship?" And he replied, "To rule oneself well and not to be led astray by wealth or fame to immoderate or unseemly desires. This is a true way of ruling in if you reason the matter well out. For all that you really need is yours, and God is free from need and benignant withal. Let your thoughts be such as become a man, and desire not many things, but only such as are necessary for ruling." The king praised him and asked another man, and he replied, "You have asked me a question which is very difficult to answer, for we cannot bring our true selves into play during the hours for sleep, but are held fast in these by imaginations that cannot be controlled by reason. For our souls possess the feeling that they actually see the things that enter into our consciousness during sleep. But we make a mistake if we suppose that we are actually sailing on the sea in boats, or flying through the air, or traveling to other regions, or anything else of the kind. And yet we actually do imagine such things to be taking place. So far as it is possible for me to decide, I have reached the following conclusion. You must, in every possible way, O king, govern your words. Max, if I come to this side, I'll move you. Your words and actions by the rule of piety, that you may have the consciousness that you are maintaining virtue, and that you never choose to gratify yourself at the expense of reason, and never by abusing your power do despite to right sleep with the same things with which it occupies itself when awake. And he who has all his thoughts and actions set towards the noblest ends establishes himself in righteousness, both when he is awake and when he is asleep. Wherefore you must be steadfast in the constant discipline of self. The king bestowed praise on the man and said to another, "Since you are the 10th to answer, when you have spoken, we will devote ourselves to the banquet." And then he put the question, "How can I avoid doing anything unworthy of myself?" And he replied, "Look always to your own fame and your own supreme position, that you may speak and think only such things as are consistent therewith, knowing that all your subjects think and talk about you. For you must not appear to be worse than the actors, who study carefully the role which it is necessary for them to play, and shape all their actions in accordance with it. You are not acting a part, but are really a king, since God has bestowed upon you a royal authority in keeping with your character." When the king had applauded aloud and long in the most gracious way, the guests were urged to seek repose. So when the conversation ceased, they devoted themselves to the next course of the feast. On the following day, the same arrangement was observed, and when the king found an opportunity for putting questions to the men, he questioned the first of those who had been left over for the next interrogation. "What is the highest form of government?" And he replied, "To rule oneself and not to be carried away by impulses, for all men possess a certain natural bent of mind. It is probable that most men have an inclination towards food and drink and pleasure, and kings a bent towards the acquisition of territory and great renown. But it is good that there should be moderation in all things. What God gives, that you must take and keep, but never yearn for things that are beyond your reach." Pleased with these words, the king asked the next how he could be free from envy. And he, after a brief pause, replied, "If you consider first of all that it is God who bestows on all kings glory and great wealth, and no one is king by his own power, all men wish to share this glory, but cannot, since it is the gift of God." The king praised the man in a long speech, and then asked another how he could despise his enemies. And he replied, "If you show kindness to all men and win their friendship, you need fear no one. To be popular with all men is the best of good gifts to receive from God." Having praised this answer, the king ordered the next man to reply to the question how he could maintain his great renown. And he replied that if you are generous and large hearted in bestowing kindness and acts of grace upon others, you will never lose your renown. But if you wish the aforesaid graces to continue yours, you must call upon God's continually. Upon God continually. The king expressed his approval and asked the next, to whom ought a man to show liberality? And he replied, all men acknowledge that we ought to show liberality to those who are well disposed towards us. But I think that we ought to show the same keen spirit of generosity to those who are opposed to us, that by this means we may win them over to the right and to what is advantageous to ourselves. But we must pray to God that this may be accomplished, for he rules the minds of all men. Having expressed his agreement with the answer, the king asked the sixth to reply to the question, to whom ought we to exhibit gratitude? And he replied, to our parents continually, for God has given us a most important commandment with regard to the honor due to parents. In the next place, he reckons the attitude of friend towards friend, for he speaks of a friend which is as thine own soul. You do well in trying to bring all men into friendship with yourself. The king spoke kindly to him and then asked the next, what is it that resembles beauty and value? Bex, make up your mind which side you're going on. Hey. You just put me in full screen, buddy. What did I have to press? F1? Shoot. Bex. I don't know how to get out of this. Shoot. You do well in trying to bring all men into friendship with yourself. The king spoke kindly to him and then asked the next, what is that resembles beauty and value? And he said, piety, for it is the preeminent form of beauty, and its power lies in love, which is the gift of God. This you have already acquired, and with it all the blessings of life. The king, in the most gracious way, applauded the answer and asked another how if he were to fail, regain his reputation again in the same degree. And he said, it is not possible for you to fail, for you have to sown in all men the seeds of gratitude, which produce a harvest of goodwill. And this is mightier than the strongest weapons and guarantees the greatest security. But if any man does fail, he must never again do those things which cause his failure. But he must form friendships and act justly, for it is the gift of God to be able to do good actions and not the contrary. Delighted with these words, the king asked another how he could be free from grief. And he replied, if he never injured anyone, but did good to everybody and followed the pathway of righteousness, for its fruits bring freedom from grief. But we must pray to God that unexpected evils such as death or disease or pain or anything of this kind may not come upon us and injure us. But since you are devoted to piety, no such misfortune will ever come upon you. The king bestowed great praise upon him and asked the 10th, what is the highest form of glory? And he said, to honor God. And this is done not with gifts and sacrifices, but with purity of soul and holy conviction. Since all things are fashioned and governed by God in accordance with his will, of this purpose you are in constant possession, as all men can see from your achievements in the past and in the present. With loud voice the king greeted them all and spoke kindly to them, and all those who were represented expressed their approval, especially the philosophers, for they were far superior to them, i.e. the philosophers, both in conduct and in argument, since they always made God their starting point. After this, the king, to show his good feeling, proceeded to drink the health of his guests. Okay, that's it for chapters 1 through 8. I have no idea how to get out of screen. There we go. Okay, thanks for, there's like a ton of, thank you, Ricky J. Rias, for watching and listening today. Happy Thanksgiving to you too. Thanks for watching and listening, guys. Have a great Thanksgiving. Bye.